Hey, welcome back. Made it to part two of connective tissues, or part two of tissues, I should say. We're looking at connective tissues. Now, connective tissues, it's probably the trickiest category of tissue because it's all sorts of really diverse tissues, okay? Now, many of these tissues are vascular. To be vascular means it has blood vessels. So you have a blood supply to these tissues, unlike epithelial tissues who get all their nutrients, or which get all their nutrients from diffusion. But generally speaking, connective tissues are vascular. They have blood supply. Some of them don't, so we'll look at some exceptions. Now, the tricky thing about connective tissues is that they are so diverse. There are all sorts of different types of connective tissue, but the general rule of thumb is that connective tissues are living cells surrounded by a non-living extracellular matrix that they produce. So they produce this material in which the cells live that's not living. So it's living cells in a non-living material that they produce. Usually it's called like a ground substance, which is what we see in cartilages, or like proteins, which is what we see in like dense fibrous connective tissues like ligaments. Okay, so let's just jump in and look at some of the different types of connective tissue. First type of connective tissue we'll look at is bone. Okay, now again, you might think of connective tissue and you think of like, collagen or something holding things together, but bone is actually connective tissue. Now, again, let's think about why. We have living cells in a non-living extracellular matrix. So this is a cross-section of a piece of hardened bone. So like if you think about sort of like a classic bone shape that you might be familiar with from like cartoons or whatever, if you look at this sort of make a cross-section, a cut, and look down on that bone at a microscopic level, this is what it looks like. So those dark spots that you see in here, those are called lacunae. Those are little divots in the bone, and you actually have cells that live in those little divots. Now, this is preserved tissue, so everything's dead in here. But when before the sample was taken, you had living cells, and then it's surrounded by this calcified material. That's what makes it hardened bone. So the little cells are called osteocytes. Osteo means bone, cyte means, or cyto means cell. So there are little cells that live in that material, and then they secrete that hardened bone around the outside. Okay? We should say, protection, support. You can store ions in bone, so those are different functions of bone. Cartilages. Cartilages are made by cells called chondrocytes. Chondr means cartilage. So like sharks belong to class chondrichthyes or chondrichthyes. Chondr again means cartilage. Ichthos means fish. So sharks are like cartilaginous fish. Well, we have cartilages in our bodies, and they're made by cells called chondrocytes. And cartilage provides different types of support around the body. The first type of cartilage we'll look at is what's called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the smooth, glossy cartilage that covers the ends of long bones. So like in your joints, like your fingers, your elbows, your knees, the ends of the bones are covered in hyaline cartilage. Again, it's real smooth and glossy, so it reduces friction when the joints are moving. So if we look in at the microscope image, there's the hyaline cartilage, looking at it from far away. And then if you zoom in on that, it's mostly that ground tissue. Okay, it's the cartilage. And then you see the little chondrocytes, the cells that produce the cartilage in there. You see the purple nuclei of the cells. Okay, so the chondrocytes produce that glossy hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage is different because fibrocartilage produces really a bunch of fibrous proteins. So this is a type of cartilage that's really tough. Okay, so fibrocartilage discs are what we see between our vertebrae and our back. So you have the bones of your vertebral column, but you need some flexibility or some movement in that, right? So these fibrocartilage discs provide some joint space in there, and it allows a little bit of flexibility in those joints. Now, again, you can't move the distance between two vertebrae much because those fibers make it a really tough, dense disc. The last type of cartilage we'll look at is elastic cartilage. Now, if something is elastic, that means you can stretch it, and then when you release the tension, it goes back to its original shape. So your nose, your ears, they contain elastic cartilage. And again, that provides the ability to deform, but then go back to the original shape. Okay, here is a type of connective tissue that we may think of as more, classically connective tissue. This is a dense fibrous connective tissue. Now, dense fibrous connective tissue produces a lot of proteins. You have these collagen proteins that are sort of like woven ropes. And since you have these interwoven ropes all running parallel to one another, it creates this really tough material that can withstand a lot of pull, a lot of tension. Okay. So we use dense fibrous connective tissue to hold things together. So a couple of classic examples: tendons and ligaments. Tendons hold muscles to bone. So you have connective tissue sort of surrounding muscle fibers, and then the connective tissue extends beyond the muscle, and then it connects to bone. So tendons hold muscles to bone so that when the muscles contract, it moves the bones. Ligaments connect bones to bones. Okay. So like an ACL, it's an anterior cruciate ligament that's made of dense fibrous connective tissue, like woven ropes that holds the bones of your leg to the bone of your thigh. Okay. Let's see. So dense fibrous connective tissues. Loose connective tissues have protein fibers, but if you look at them, there are a lot fewer fibers, and then they sort of interweave in different directions. Now, that space created by the fibers allows areolar tissue to retain or hold water. Okay, so areolar tissue is sort of, I think of it as like a packing material in the body. It's a tissue that surrounds the organs of the body and helps, again, trap water because you need water surrounding cells in the body. If you get edema or swelling, a lot of times you get swelling in that areolar tissue. Another type of loose connective tissue is adipose tissue. Fat is actually connective tissue. So in the bottom right, you can see the adipocytes, or the fat cells. Most of the space inside the cell is these globules of fat. So you're able to store a lot of energy. Store a lot of energy. Fat provides cushioning too. So like your kidneys are surrounded by some fat, so it provides some protection. And then that also traps heat. So it's an insulator. So that's why I've not been cold since 1996. All right. Blood. This is probably the one that's most difficult for people to remember, but blood is actually a tissue, and it's a connective tissue. Remember, our rule of thumb for connective tissues: living cells surrounded by a non-living extracellular matrix or material they produce. Well, we have red blood cells and white blood cells moving through and living in this non-living plasma. Plasma is the fluid part of blood. So again, you have the red blood cells and white blood cells sort of moving through this plasma. And blood is really important because it's sort of this river that carries materials all throughout the body. If you have trillions of cells that all need to get rid of waste and bring in raw materials, the blood transports that at an adequate pace. You can pump all 5 liters of blood from your heart out to your body and back in a single minute. So it's sort of remarkable to pump 5 liters of blood through 60,000 miles of blood vessels to 10 trillion cells and back in 60 seconds. But your body can do it. Okay. So again, it's a transport medium. But again, it's a type of connective tissue. All right. That takes us through connective tissues. One last video to go. Thanks for sticking with it.